My name is Jim Conlan, and welcome to this week's Politics Show. As you know, on the Politics Show each week, we run an international feature where we look at an ongoing dispute or conflict around the world and its impacts that it's having, and how it can bear back to us in terms of Ireland and the European Union. And up for discussion this week, we're going to look at maybe two possibly ongoing conflicts and how they interlap and how they probably affect each other. And over the world at the moment, everyone is talking about Iran and Israel and America, the three-way triangle. But we have to remember before Iran and Israel, there was an ongoing conflict, and there still is very much an ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And I have a special guest joining us today to look into those issues, look into how they overlap. My guest this evening is a strategic consultant for the Ukraine Defence and Intelligence. She represents Ukraine defence and intelligence interests, negotiating with global stakeholders to protect national security of Ukraine. Kate McKenna. Kate, delighted to have you with us there today. And I give a brief synopsis of your role in terms of working with the Ukraine in terms of this. May I ask, has this been an ongoing role for the past number of years, even before this conflict began?
No, not really at all, to be honest. In February 2022, I had no idea really about defense, but my background is in geopolitics. My first career was in investment banking, in capital markets, and working with sovereign entities. So it was money then, and it's guns now. So
Okay. And you're very much operating at the top level in terms of strategic advice, in terms of national governments, stakeholders, in terms of that negotiating on the front line, dealing with administrations.
yeah, well, I tried to do my best, and I work as an advocate and a lobbyist to try and get the weapon systems and the support that Ukraine needs, and to remind our allies how important it is that we protect and maintain Ukraine. I think that today's NATO meeting made that very, very clear. If Ukraine were to be lost, we will lose, well, the Baltics. Russia is obviously sitting on the Finnish border and is a very real threat. One of the things I've focused on for the last year is hybrid warfare. And I don't think people in the West are fully aware of the fact that the Russians are causing so much mayhem and chaos, that the attacks are increasing, and that, it's kinetic at this point. So we're talking about bombs, we're talking about terrorism, and this is a Russian thing that is happening in Europe today. And if Ukraine were to be lost, if Russia were to be successful here, that will only exponentially increase. And what we're seeing in the Middle East is Russian fueled. All of these crises come from Russia and from China. The geopolitical spectrum since Trump took over has become really very, very dangerous for all of us.
Yeah. And Kate, when you look at the rhetoric coming out of the White House and the speech coming out of Donald Trump and the glorifying of, say, Israel, and the glorifying of these allegiance, and obviously paying these cards firmly out in the open, stating his friendship. He mentioned many a times his friendship with Putin. He's mentioning his friendship with Netanyahu. He's publicly declaring that. Is that a very worrying sign that you have a president maybe off kilter that can turn a switch? We know he said he needed 2 weeks most recently to determine the best course of action, which was a decoy, as we all saw, and that he acted when Iran's guard maybe was maybe a little bit down in terms of that. Does that sort of look onto that and see that you have maybe someone in control of a power in the White House that, dare I say, is very tangible, that does things on a on a whimper, and dare I say, can state something publicly and declare it, and then maybe within the 5, 6 hours do something completely the opposite?
Yeah, he's very mercurial. And I'm not representing the Ukrainian government when I say this, but he is a very difficult character and one that I wouldn't trust. The Kellogg, who is the Russian-Ukrainian advisor, if you would, he pretty much wrote what we were seeing today. So Kellogg is one of the advisors for America First. And in his 2023 essay that he wrote, he talked about the fact that he was going to coerce Ukraine and force Ukraine to surrender in favor of Russia, and he was going to use the supply of weapons and support from America to force Ukraine to its knees. Kellogg came out with that it seems to be the White House current policy, and I think it is a huge, huge mistake. I think it makes the world a lot less safe. Trump is obviously very much in love with autocracy. He has mentioned that he wished his people, as in other words, Americans, behaved a bit more like Russians. One of the things that I focus on is the disinformation information warfare space. And I am currently publishing a series of posts, the 3,000 characters, so people can understand them, on exactly how that works in Russia. And people are now finally realizing what they're seeing in America in this space and how effective it is in terms of people's understanding and how they become stuck in this bubble of information and they don't realize what is actually going on. It's almost like you can create reality that has nothing to do with objective truth. You can show somebody the truth, like Trump, and say, hey, dude, the truth. And he's going to meander around it and find his own little bubble of whatever it is that he wants to believe. In terms of the Iranian situation and that bombing, the Iranians knew, and they were received information on exactly what would be hit. They had opportunity to remove what they needed to remove. We have seen the satellite images of the trucks turning up, but prior to that, they had plenty of time to remove what they needed. These Iranian hits, these bombers, it was for show. It was really for show. As for his relationship with Netanyahu, to be perfectly honest, if I was Israel, I'd be very, very concerned because I do not think Trump has Israel's back in any way, shape, or form. And that is certainly, if you look at who put Trump into the White House, it's important to understand who did that. The Heritage Foundation and the evangelists, they do not support Israel other than after 7 years of pestilence and pain for Israel, there has to be a few Jews still living in Israel for the coming of the Messiah. That's it. For the day of judgment to come here, those 7 years have to start. And they may well have started. And I don't see anything in the Trump administration to say that he is Israel's friend. Rather, he is doing what he does, which is showmanship. And I think that that is what the bombs were. They were show
Yeah.
with
And Kate,
absolutely no
yeah.
effect, to be honest.
Kate, we mentioned there about Donald Trump and you mentioned showmanship. And if you're looking on at this from a Zelensky point of view, you see America saying when Trump said when he get elected that they would never again get involved in wars, foreign wars, that never would affect them, that there wouldn't be boots on the ground, dare I say. And the public bought into that. They didn't want a repeat of Iraq, they didn't want a repeat of Afghanistan, of American soldiers passing for a war that didn't concern them. But when Zelensky looks at this and when he sees the American bombers get involved in a war, strategic drones take out important sites, does he ever fear, dare I say, that while America might never get involved in terms of troops on the ground in terms of Russia and Ukraine, that Trump might use such a strategy down the term if tensions turn really sour in terms of drones or strategic strikes against the Ukraine that we see, or is that never an issue?
No, I don't think so because I mean, as awful as it is right now, I don't see America ever um, siding with Russia other than opening trade routes, trying to force Russia into G7. We've seen that. I don't think that the Trump administration is in any way, shape, or form understanding the threat that Russia is. But in terms of what America can do to Ukraine is to remove the support, and that is something that is obviously very, very scary. Um, if Ukraine still had its nuclears, its nukes, which were taken away in the Budapest memorandum, and the agreement that was done with Britain and with America and with Russia and so on, and if they still had that nuclear capability, this would not be the situation they're facing. So the fact that they are in this situation, we have to take responsibility for, I believe. But more than that, Ukraine is holding back Russia. And if we allow it to take over Ukraine, the world becomes a lot less safe. China moves on Taiwan. China's already moving in the around Japan. Japan is very concerned. South Korea is concerned. North Korea has Russia helping them with their nuclear capability. In terms of nuclear situation, it's a lot more dangerous. Trump said that he was never going to go to war, but in his administration, in the first half of the year of his second administration, we now have three wars. So that's not doing too well, is it? Like, bit of a
No.
fail, I'd say. Bit of an epic fail, that one.
Kate, is Vladimir Putin using Iran as a deflection tactic, dare I say, in terms of all the tension, all the focus in terms of public eyes being on Iran and Israel at the moment? It doesn't seem to be at all that Putin has any real concerns about what happens to Iran in terms of that. It's Russia sort of focused, Russia self-centered, and maybe what is going on in Iran and Russia sort of distancing from itself maybe keeps pressure off dare I say, the Soviets, it keeps pressure off the KGB, Russia, military-driven sort of force to make progression and inroads in terms of Ukraine, in terms of what their plans are, in terms of maybe the spotlight not being on them as extensive as what it was maybe earlier in 2024. That Iran, dare I say, while what's going on, the Russians might be in favor of it completely, but it's dare I say, it's taking the focus off of Russia in terms of world and global view.
Yeah, I think that you're right that they do see this as a bonus. Iran and Russia are not good friends. We saw some FSB, which is the FSB took over from KGB. The FSB emails were hacked, and in those emails we see that the Russians do not trust the Iranians, and the Iranians do not trust the Russians. There's no love lost. But this situation was caused by Netanyahu feeling like he had no choice but to bomb Iran. And then, with what happened then, the Americans had to step in. They were forced to. But this goes back to the situation that Trump has effectively caused, which is to back off on Israel, to make Israel feel unsafe. And he did that on his recent trip to the Middle East, where he completely ignored Israel. He agreed to 6 different things, which were red lines for Israel, with Saudi, Qatar, Syria. I mean, he even met with a former terrorist that they had in Guantanamo Bay and shook hands with him and said he's a great guy. There is no safety in that kind of leadership that we're seeing from America, and it made Israel feel very, very unsafe. And that is what we're seeing today. In terms of its impact on Ukraine, it is really unhelpful because everybody's eyes on that. And we saw that the sanctions were moving forward against Russia, which is what something we really need from the Senate. And that was pushing forward. And as soon as this Iranian thing blew up, that the Senate pulled back and said, I'm sorry, but apparently America can't chew gum and walk at the same time. We can't do this sanctions against Russia and focused on Iran. Sorry, we can only do one thing at a time, which is absolutely ridiculous and kind of embarrassing, to be honest. But that's how it is. And now we don't see any motivation in the US to follow up with those sanctions, and those sanctions are paramount. We must stop the Russian war machine. And I've just seen the numbers coming out on the number of civilians killed in Ukraine. And in 2024 and now in 2025, we're seeing double the number of civilians killed in Ukraine to the start of the war. And I can tell you myself that, we're seeing new Shaheed coming in that we cannot shoot down. They're targeting apartments. They're targeting hospitals. They're killing people on purpose. And they're not just killing one or two, they're flattening apartment blocks while people are asleep.
And Kate, really in this era of what the White House administration, and we're probably seeing NATO and the European Union really not being a strong deterrent or a stronger voice that they need to be. Is really public diplomacy working now in this century? Is public diplomacy
No.
really dead on its heels? Is it a strategy that is maybe seeing its best of the year? Because it seems to be like we have a rhetoric here that but the White House has no real respect or really undermines the power of European Union or NATO and thinks that it can be, dare I say, got around or coerced, dare I say, very easily. And is that worrying from the Ukrainian that maybe the French and German voice isn't as strong as what it needs to be in this current era?
Well, I'll deal with the American and the Trump dismantling of international law. So the Russians have done a very good job of dismantling. For democracy doesn't exist naturally. For democracy to exist and for us to have confidence in democracy, we must have multilateral organizations and international law that we trust. So what the Trump administration now and what has happened in America has basically attacked those institutions that protect and defend democracy. And we've seen that on the international stage as well. And what Trump has done is he's tried to ignore Europe. He's attacked Europe. We saw that where they actually attacked Europe. We saw Vance on Heges and we saw Trump attacking Europe, but individually speaking to those countries, but undermining that multilateral organization, which is Europe. And that is an attack on democracy itself. In terms of diplomacy, you can't so one of the things that's really important to understand about the Russian constitution is the Russian constitution states that the Russian laws supersede all other laws, including international law. That means that any treaty or any agreement that Russia ever signs can be dissolved like that because Russia law is supersedes all other laws. No other country has that. The other thing is that they have very specific laws which they have created, especially for the Ukrainian and for whatever they plan for the Baltics and whatever they plan for Poland and Romania and Moldova. And that is where they have this one law which talks about terrorism. And terrorism is something that they use as a weapon. So when they talk about Ukrainian and President Zelensky being a terrorist, that's a very important word because legally, what that means for the Russians is they can do whatever they like to that person or that country when they designate it a terrorist country. So that's how they are okay to torture and to kill prisoners of war in Kursk. We've seen that the prisoners of war that were taken in Kursk have been tortured, starved. They have been sentenced to gulags and vanished. And the Russian constitution allows them to do that. As far as they're concerned, that supersedes all international laws, including the Geneva Convention. How can you have any diplomatic relations with a country who views the world like that? I don't believe that you can.
And Kate, we see around the Baltics area, and we see those sort of satellite states that what Russia deems them to be, and we see them wanting to move more towards the European Union. We see the uprisings and the protests on the streets of Georgia at the moment, in terms of Minsk and Tbilisi and places like that. The Georgian people are maybe taking some bit of inspiration from the Ukrainians in terms of leaning towards that. But is Russia seeing what happened in the Ukraine as probably a growing sort of trend around that Baltic states that if they don't be decisive in Ukraine, that what we're seeing in Georgia going on, there might be a fear that maybe Belarus might side against its sort of government, which would be a radical step given how close the Belarus government and its ties to Russia. But the people in Belarus, dare I say, who might look at their current regime and say we could be do more better if we're associated more towards the West. Is that what Russia are looking at to say that we are strong and decisive in Ukraine, that will diminish what is going on in Georgia at the moment, and it won't convince maybe the people of Belarus to follow suit either?
Well, so it's very important to understand that the Russians are imperialists. They are not a democracy. They have a very distinct and very different view of the world, and it's unchanged since the 1600s, to be perfectly honest. And that's not me being racist; that is actual fact. So when they look at Ukraine, when they look at Belarus, when they look at Georgia, they see parts of their country. They don't see these nations as having the right to be sovereign states. And so Ukraine is an insult. That's why you hear Putin saying that he wants to basically eradicate all Ukrainians because they shouldn't be Ukrainians. In the literature, if you look at Dostoevsky and if you look at other literature within the Russian in Russian literature and also in Russian mindset, Ukrainians are just sick Russians. They should either be taught to be good Russians or they should be eradicated. And that's not so different to how they view Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Belarus. And Georgia, they attacked Georgia in 2008. And that was the precursor for Ukraine. And the Georgians warned the world, and we didn't listen to them. And then we saw in 2014 when the Ukrainians decided they wanted to join Europe, and we had Maidan, which was basically a revolution to say, no, we want freedoms, we want our democracy, we want to be a sovereign nation. And in response to that, Russia invaded, took over Crimea, and we ignored it. We didn't do anything, and we would have been in a very different situation today if we had taken action at that time, and we didn't. So I'm hoping that the world makes a different decision today because this is not going to be stopped if we don't stop it right here today, now, and support Ukrainians. This is going to get a lot more dangerous. And I think it's important for Ireland to remember that the USSR funded the IRA.
And Kate, looking at this, is there any sort of learnings what's going on in the Middle East? Is there any sort of learnings for Zelensky in this that he can take out of this in terms of and bringing it back to his own government in terms, I know that's an awful thing to say, there's never really any learnings in terms of war except for casualties, but is there anything that he can look in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of the sides and the stances of all the players in the Middle East that he can say, right, there's certain things here that I can take from this in terms of personality wise, that I can, and maybe character driven wise, in terms of the stances of certain big players that I can say, right, this is tell me something that I can bring back, that I can use in my own sort of thinkings or ideology going forward in terms of policy making or in terms of strategic, dare I say, strategic militant tactics or move that he can say, look, maybe this has taught us something about that we can play into our own situation.
I don't think so. President Zelensky has done an incredible job. I mean, I don't know any other man who could do what he has done and stood up in the way that he has. I mean, if you see how he was treated by Trump when he went to Washington, I mean, that was a setup. He knew he was walking into a setup. He still went. This is a man of incredible courage. And I think it's important to remember that Defense Intelligence Ukraine, GOR, are the guys that went in and evac'd Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, and other Scandinavian countries' personnel from those areas that were at risk. That's what Ukraine does for its partners. We go in and we rescue their citizens when they're in crisis. And this is something that is repeated across the world. So Ukraine has, I think, everybody's respect. Anybody who knows President Zelensky must have incredible respect for him because he has been able to do things which are impossible. And he sat with Trump today and they had a great conversation and he's friendly and he's smiling and he's doing all the things. I don't think there's another leader out there in the world today who could do what he has done.
On that note,
I'm
Kate
sorry.
McKenna, thanks for joining us today. Strategic consultants for the Ukraine Defense and Intelligence in terms of negotiating with global stakeholders. Thanks for taking your time today to share your thoughts on the ongoing tensions in the Middle East and how that plays back to Europe and particularly the Ukraine and Russia conflict. For me, Jim Conlan, thanks for joining the Global Politics Show for this week. From me, Jim Conlan, to you, Kate McKenna, stay safe, take care, and God bless.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.